When Gold Rush premiered in 2010, one name was deliberately left out of the cast list. That name was Tony Beets. Producers had been warned. An anonymous letter arrived before the first season even aired, telling Discovery that bringing Tony into the show would be a mistake they would regret forever. The message was clear. Do not let him in. Do not give him a platform, because if you do, he will bring nothing but chaos. At first, producers listened. They took the warning seriously enough to keep him out of season 1. But just 1 year later, something changed. In season 2, to the shock of many, Tony Beets suddenly appeared on screen. And the moment he did, everything about the show shifted. Ratings spiked, fans were instantly drawn to him, and yet behind the cameras, those same warnings didn't stop. They kept coming. Anonymous messages, strange notes, even direct claims that Tony's presence would ruin the show in ways the public couldn't even imagine. And now, years later, the haunting part is this. Those warnings didn't disappear. They came back, louder than ever, chasing the producers who ignored them and leaving everyone wondering, what exactly did Tony do that was so dark, so damaging, that it made people wish he had never stepped onto that set in the first place? Stay with me, because once you hear the story of Tony Beets and the secrets the producers ignored, you'll never see Gold Rush the same way again. The truth is, the warnings about Tony started long before he joined the crew. Someone close to the mining community reportedly wrote to Discovery in 2012, saying that hiring Tony Beets would become one of the network's greatest regrets. Think about that. A letter written more than a decade ago, claiming his presence would lead to disaster. At the time, executives brushed it off. They assumed it was just a jealous rival or maybe a bitter neighbor with a grudge. But what happened next proved this wasn't just the rant of some anonymous hater. Because the moment Tony appeared on screen, he didn't just join the show, he took over the show. Viewers fell in love instantly. His raw, unfiltered personality was unlike anything else on television. He wasn't polished. He wasn't fake. He didn't try to play nice for the cameras. He was loud, rough, brutally honest, and in many ways unstoppable. He carried himself like a Viking straight out of history, a man who lived by his own rules and didn't care who got in his way. And that image, the Viking of the Klondike, quickly turned him into a fan favorite. Ratings soared. Discovery executives celebrated. And yet, behind the applause, the warnings kept piling up. People claimed that Tony wasn't just a miner with a big mouth. He was a man with secrets, a man who had done things in the gold fields that would never survive under the harsh light of television exposure. The strange part, some of those rumors were so specific that it's almost impossible to believe they were made up. But let me ask you this. What kind of person inspires strangers to write anonymous warnings even before they're famous? What did they know about Tony Beets that the rest of us did? And why were the producers so determined to ignore it? Now here's where the story gets even more fascinating. Tony didn't just win fans, he beat his rivals on screen. He found gold where others couldn't. He outworked and outsmarted the competition, proving himself as not just entertaining, but also incredibly successful. Every time another miner failed, Tony somehow came out ahead. That mix of charisma and results made him unstoppable. At least, that's how it looked to the audience. But according to whispers from behind the scenes, there was another side to the story. Crew members spoke quietly about his temper, about how he pushed people harder than anyone else, about deals he made that never made it into the episodes. And then there was the darker rumor, the one almost no one wants to repeat, that Tony's dominance in the gold fields didn't always come from playing fair. And that brings us back to the warnings, because now, looking at everything we know, it's hard not to wonder, were those early letters trying to tell us something more, something the cameras never showed? Imagine this. You're a TV producer in 2012. You've got a star who pulls in millions of viewers. Fans love him. Advertisers love him. But behind the curtain, you've got anonymous letters piling up, telling you that this man will destroy everything. What would you do? Would you ignore it like Discovery did, or would you listen? That's the exact dilemma the producers faced. And by ignoring it, they may have unleashed one of the most controversial figures in reality television history. But here's the chilling part. Years later, those warnings are still haunting them because Tony Beets didn't just change Gold Rush. He changed the entire way people see the show. And the question we have to ask is this: what did the producers miss? What did they choose to look away from? Before I reveal more, I want to hear from you. Do you think producers should have listened to those early warnings? Or do you think Tony Beets was the best thing that ever happened to Gold Rush? Let me know in the comments, because this debate has divided fans for years. And trust me, you'll want to stick around, because the deeper we dig, the darker Tony's story becomes. Tony Beets didn't just show up with personality, he showed up with power. While other cast members struggled with outdated equipment and limited resources, Tony rolled in with heavy machinery that dwarfed anything else on set. Massive trucks, towering excavators, and equipment so expensive that many miners could only dream of touching it. In a show about survival and struggle, Tony arrived already looking like he had conquered the Klondike. And Discovery loved it. The cameras adored the scale of his operations. The audience couldn't look away. Every time Tony appeared, ratings surged. More viewers meant more advertisers, and more advertisers meant more money. From the network's perspective, Tony wasn't just a character. He was a gold mine all on his own. Why listen to anonymous warnings when his very presence was adding millions to their pockets? But the letters didn't stop. Week after week, year after year, Discovery continued receiving anonymous notes. Some were typed, some handwritten, some arrived by email. All carried the same message: get Tony off the show before it's too late. The warnings weren't vague either. They painted Tony as a man who never intended to follow the rules. A man who only pretended to respect authority when the cameras were rolling, but behind the scenes pushed every boundary he could. According to these letters, Tony was reckless. He had a temper that could ignite at any moment. He didn't negotiate, he demanded. He didn't compromise, he bulldozed. And one day, those habits would lead to disaster. Now think about this. Imagine you're a producer watching Tony explode on screen, delivering the kind of raw drama reality TV thrives on. You see the numbers rising. You see the fans loving him. Do you shut him down because of faceless warnings? Or do you ride the wave, knowing that every episode he stars in means millions of people tuning in? Discovery made their choice. They ignored the warnings. At first, they tried to keep him on a leash. Quiet monitoring, producers shadowing him closely. Even when the show wasn't scripted, there were limits he was expected to respect. And for a while, Tony played along. He gave them just enough chaos to entertain without crossing lines that could backfire. But how long can you really control a man like Tony Beets? How long before a personality, that explosive, breaks through every boundary you try to set? The truth is, Discovery was addicted to him. They couldn't let him go. His popularity had grown too large, his name too valuable. Fans weren't tuning in for gold anymore. They were tuning in for Tony, and that made him untouchable. As long as he was on screen, Discovery was making money, and money has a way of silencing doubt. Still, the letters never stopped. Each one begged Discovery to take him off the show, warning that keeping him would lead to bigger and bigger problems. The producers, blinded by ratings, kept him anyway. And then, in 2014, the thing everyone feared finally happened. Tony Beets and his crew at Tamarack Inc. decided to make a move that would forever stain his reputation. They brought one of his massive old dredges back to life. For the cameras, it was perfect. The storyline of a legendary Viking miner resurrecting a forgotten piece of history was television gold. Viewers loved it. Ratings climbed again. But here's what the cameras didn't show. During one of those dredge operations, Tony and his crew attempted a stunt that crossed a very dangerous line. They decided to pour gasoline directly into a waterway, setting the surface of the river on fire. That's right, fire on water. The scene looked dramatic, shocking, and undeniably cinematic. But it wasn't just reckless, it was illegal. And the fallout came quickly. Environmental authorities launched an investigation. What Tony thought was just another bold move for TV turned into a legal nightmare. He was fined thousands of dollars for violating environmental protection laws. Suddenly, those anonymous warnings didn't look so crazy anymore. Let me ask you, if you had been the producer, would you have kept airing Tony after that? Or would you have finally pulled the plug? Discovery didn't. They doubled down. Even with fines, even with public backlash, they knew Tony brought the kind of chaos that kept viewers hooked. And the truth is, controversy only made him bigger. Fans debated endlessly. Was he a reckless outlaw, or just a fearless pioneer willing to do whatever it took to win? Every argument meant more attention, and attention is the most valuable currency in television. But behind closed doors, some insiders whispered that this was only the beginning. Tony's temper was becoming harder to control. His crew feared him at times, but also depended on him. He was the kind of man people love to hate, and Discovery couldn't resist feeding that narrative. And here's the thing. That dredge incident wasn't just a one-time mistake. According to locals, Tony's methods had always pushed environmental boundaries. Noise complaints, property disputes, allegations of bending mining rules to his advantage. Some of it was speculation. Some of it was documented. But together, it painted a picture of a man who played by his own rules, no matter the cost. And yet, despite all of it, Discovery kept filming. Why? Because Tony wasn't just good TV, he was the TV. The Viking miner who bent the land, bent the rules, and bent reality itself. Fans couldn't stop watching. Producers couldn't stop cashing in. But here's the chilling thought. If the dredge stunt was enough to bring environmental investigators down on him, what else had he done that we never saw? What secrets stayed off camera? And why did those anonymous letters keep insisting that one day Tony would bring the entire show crashing down? The deeper you look, the more unsettling it gets, because those warnings, ignored for years, started to look less like paranoia and more like prophecy. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Tony went too far when he set fire to the water? Or do you think it was just another wild moment that made the show unforgettable? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is where fans are completely divided. And stick with me, because the story isn't over. If you think the dredge fire was Tony's biggest controversy, you're wrong. The most shocking chapters were still to come. And what happened next didn't just put Tony at risk, it put the entire future of Gold Rush in jeopardy. They called it a Viking baptism, a ritual meant to change their luck, bless the dredge, and guarantee success. But what actually happened that day shocked not just the crew, not just the producers, but the entire audience watching at home. With his usual boldness, Tony gave the green light. He stood there, grinning, almost daring fate to intervene. "Let's see if this works," he said. And then, in an act so reckless it bordered on unbelievable, his team poured gasoline directly into a section of the Indian River near Dawson City, Yukon. What followed looked like something out of a nightmare. The water itself erupted into flames. A wall of fire rose across the surface of the river, turning it into a burning inferno. The crew stared in disbelief. The producers froze, cameras still rolling. And at home, millions of viewers watched the impossible unfold, a river on fire. Most men would have panicked. Most would have shown at least a flicker of regret, but not Tony Beets. Standing before the blaze, he smirked and delivered a line that would forever define the scandal. "See, I told you it would be sink or swim." Not remorseful, not apologetic, defiant, almost proud. And in that moment, it became clear he didn't care about the fish in the water, the wildlife surrounding the camp, or even the safety of the men standing just a few feet from the fire. To him, it was spectacle, drama, another story for the cameras. But the reaction outside that camp was instant and brutal. Viewers lit up social media, furious at what they had just seen. Fans who had once adored Tony now accused him of environmental destruction. Critics called it a disgrace, a reckless violation of responsibility. Some even demanded that Discovery remove him from the show entirely. And then came the whistleblower. A passerby who had witnessed the flames reported the incident directly to Yukon mining inspectors. Within days, investigators descended on the camp, catching both Discovery and Tony's crew completely off guard. The charges were serious: pollution, violation of water license conditions, environmental contamination. Suddenly, this wasn't just a storyline, it was a legal disaster. Tony himself, along with one of his crew members, was arrested for the fire stunt. Yes, arrested. And the producers weren't safe either. For allowing it to happen, for failing to report it to the authorities, Discovery was dragged into court. It was a direct violation of their water license, a license that was supposed to protect the very waterways Tony had just set ablaze. Think about that. A reality TV stunt had turned into a courtroom scandal, the kind of thing that could have ended the entire show overnight. Now here's the part that most people don't know. Behind the scenes, Discovery executives scrambled. They knew the footage was dynamite, shocking, controversial, unforgettable. But they also knew the legal consequences were real. Air it, and they faced backlash and fines. Hide it, and they risked losing the ratings boost that Tony's chaos always delivered. In the end, they gambled. They showed it. And while the fines rolled in, so did the viewers. The controversy only fueled the fire. People couldn't stop talking about it. Was Tony a reckless outlaw destroying the environment for fame? Or was he simply the kind of larger-than-life character reality TV was built for? That debate kept the show alive. But the truth is, Tony's Viking baptism left scars far deeper than anyone realized. For one, it exposed the producers. No longer could they hide behind the excuse that Tony's antics were just part of the act. Now the world saw that Discovery wasn't just documenting him, they were enabling him. By allowing the fire, by failing to report it, they had become accomplices. And that sparked a bigger question. If they covered up this, what else had they allowed Tony to get away with? Some former crew members began to whisper about his temper, about the way he pushed people to their limits, caring little about safety if it slowed him down. Others hinted at deals, shortcuts, and rule bending that never made it into the episodes. And then came the rumor that chilled fans to their core, that Tony's dominance wasn't just about hard work, but about cutting corners the cameras were never allowed to show. Now let me ask you, do you think this Viking baptism was just a mistake? Or do you think it revealed the truth about who Tony Beets really is? Because here's the thing. Once the river fire scandal hit the headlines, those anonymous warnings suddenly made sense. The letters that had been dismissed as jealousy or hate mail looked more like prophecy. They had warned exactly this would happen. Tony pushing the limits, Tony ignoring the rules, Tony dragging everyone down with him. And yet, despite everything, the arrests, the fines, the courtroom drama, Discovery still kept him on the show. Why? Simple. Because Tony Beets had become bigger than the scandal, bigger than the law. He was the star fans loved to hate, the outlaw who made gold rush unpredictable. But here's the terrifying thought. If this was the stunt that got caught, what about the ones that did? If he was willing to set an entire river on fire just for television, what else was he capable of doing when the cameras weren't rolling? The Viking baptism wasn't the end of Tony's controversies. It was only the beginning. and what came after would push the show into even darker territory. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Tony should have been banned from Gold Rush after the fire? Or do you think Discovery was right to keep him, no matter the cost? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious how you see it. And don't go anywhere, because in the next part, we'll reveal how the fire scandal opened the door to even more shocking allegations, secrets that could have ended not just Tony's career, but the entire future of Gold Rush itself. The Viking baptism didn't just spark flames on the river, it ignited a firestorm in the courts. News of the incident spread quickly across Yukon and beyond. Headlines screamed about environmental damage. Social media lit up with rumors that Tony Beets had been thrown in jail, left to face the consequences alone, while Discovery considered pulling the plug on Gold Rush entirely. Fans were divided. Some believed he deserved prison time. Others insisted it was just another example of Tony being Tony. But what was the truth? Did he really end up behind bars? When the case finally reached the courtroom, Judge Kisham made it clear that he wasn't impressed by Tony's Viking swagger. Watching the video evidence, the judge said it was undeniable that Tony had acted recklessly, almost gleefully participating in a stunt that put both the environment and his crew at risk. His smirk, his words, his posture, it all screamed defiance, not regret. Judge Kisham pointed out that Tony could have stopped the entire stunt with a single word. He didn't have to let his crew pour gasoline into the river. He didn't have to let them set it ablaze. But instead, he gave the green light, fully aware of the danger and the illegality of what they were about to do. And Discovery, they didn't escape blame either. The court ruled that by filming the fire and later airing it, the network had crossed a dangerous line. They weren't just documenting events, they were complicit. The company was found guilty of two separate violations of its water license, a license that existed specifically to protect the Yukon's waterways from pollution and harm. The courtroom buzzed with tension as both Tony and Discovery faced the consequences. Fines were issued, legal restrictions tightened, and suddenly the mighty Viking of the Klondike looked less like an untouchable outlaw and more like a man cornered by his own arrogance. After the hearing, Tony finally broke his silence. Standing before reporters, he admitted his mistake. He said he should never have allowed the so-called baptism to happen. He admitted his decision was reckless, that he failed to stop his team when he should have. In his own words, Tony confessed, "As the boss, it was my job to control my crew. I should have stopped them. I didn't, and that's on me." But even in apology, Tony couldn't resist brushing it off. He called the whole thing a joke, a stunt meant to bless the old dredge they were working with, a machine that broke down so often it felt cursed. According to Tony, the baptism was never serious. It was nothing more than a prank that spiraled out of control. But here's the chilling question. Was it really just a joke? Or was it proof that Tony would do anything, absolutely anything, for attention and ratings? Because when you look closely, his words don't match his actions. If it was a joke, why go through with it? Why risk his crew, his business, and the environment just for a laugh? And more importantly, why did Discovery air it? The court's decision didn't just punish Tony, it exposed Discovery's complicity. Viewers suddenly saw the network in a different light. No longer were they innocent bystanders. They had allowed the stunt, filmed it, and profited from it. And if they allowed this, what else had they turned a blind eye to? For some fans, this was the turning point. The moment Gold Rush went from being a show about miners chasing dreams to a show about pushing limits, no matter the cost. Yet despite the backlash, despite the fines, despite the courtroom humiliation, Discovery didn't drop Tony. They didn't silence him. They didn't even reduce his screen time. Why? Because he was still their golden goose. The Viking baptism may have been reckless. It may have been illegal, but it was unforgettable. And in television, unforgettable moments are worth their weight in gold. And so Tony returned to the screen, still defiant, still unfiltered, still the Viking of the Klondike. And the warnings, the ones that had started long before season 2, suddenly sounded prophetic. Anonymous voices had begged Discovery to remove him before it was too late. Now, after courtrooms, fines, and international headlines, those warnings seemed more real than ever. But here's the part that should scare you the most. The Viking baptism wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Because if Tony was willing to set fire to a river and face arrest just to make a point, what else was he capable of? The deeper we dig into Tony Beets' story, the more disturbing it becomes. And in the next part, we'll uncover how this scandal wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was part of a much larger pattern that threatened not just Tony, but the very future of Gold Rush itself. But before we move forward, I want to know what you think. Do you believe Tony's apology, that it was all just a joke gone wrong? Or do you think it revealed his true nature, a man who doesn't care about rules, the law, or the environment as long as the cameras are rolling? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is where fans are still divided, even today. And trust me, you'll want to stick around. The darkest chapter of this story hasn't even started yet. In the end, what started as a so-called harmless prank cost Tony Beets far more than he ever expected. The Yukon Territorial Court delivered its verdict. Tony and his company, Tamarack Inc., were hit with a fine of $31,000. For a man like Tony, who had pulled millions in gold from the ground, it wasn't a sum that would ruin him financially. But symbolically, it was devastating. The Viking of the Klondike, the man who defied everyone and everything, had been publicly humbled in court. When reporters rushed to Tony after the ruling, shoving microphones toward him, hoping for another defiant outburst, he didn't give them the satisfaction. He stayed silent. Not a single word escaped his mouth. And Discovery, the network that had stood by him through scandal after scandal, they too refused to comment. Their silence said it all. For the first time, it was clear they weren't laughing anymore. They weren't celebrating the chaos. They were scared. Behind the scenes, insiders revealed that Tony was called in for one of the most serious conversations of his career. When he returned to Gold Rush after the fire scandal, he and his crew were handed strict warnings. No more reckless stunts. No more so-called Viking baptisms. No more dangerous jokes for the cameras. The producers were blunt. Another act like that could kill the show. Viewers were already furious. Environmental critics were circling, and Discovery itself had been fined alongside Tony. If he ever crossed that line again, it wouldn't just be his career on the chopping block. It could mean the end of Gold Rush altogether. For many fans, the damage had already been done. The river fire wasn't just a stunt, it was a betrayal. They accused Tony of caring more about fame than about the land he worked. Social media exploded with condemnation, labeling him reckless, abusive, even dangerous. Some said the show had lost its soul. Others swore off watching it ever again. And yet, just as many defended him. Some argued it was nothing more than an overblown prank. That people were taking it too seriously. That Tony had always been wild, and that was exactly why viewers tuned in. For better or worse, Tony Beets had become the most controversial figure in the history of the series. But here's the unsettling part. Even after being fined, even after standing before a judge, Tony never completely changed. He became more careful, yes. He avoided stunts that would draw legal action. But every so often, he would hint at strange, even disturbing ideas. Little comments on camera that made fans uneasy. Plans that never fully materialized, but left viewers wondering just how far he'd go if Discovery didn't hold him back. And that raises the question, how long before it happens again? How long before the Viking of the Klondike decides to test the limits one more time? Because one thing has always been true about Tony Beets. He thrives on chaos. He thrives on danger. He thrives on being the man who refuses to play by the rules. And if history has taught us anything, it's that no matter how many warnings Tony receives, no matter how many fines he pays, no matter how many critics condemn him, he always comes back stronger, louder, and more defiant than ever. But here, where the story takes an even darker turn. Because while the Viking baptism was shocking, it wasn't the only controversy tied to Tony Beets. For years, whispers had followed him. Allegations about his behavior behind the scenes. Stories of a temper so fierce that crew members sometimes feared being on his team. Rumors that his methods weren't just unconventional, they were abusive. And those rumors didn't just come from outsiders. People close to the show, people who had worked with him, began to hint that Tony wasn't just the gruff, tough miner fans saw on TV. He was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. But what exactly did they mean? What really happened when the cameras weren't rolling? And why were some people calling Tony Beets not just the Viking of Gold Rush, but the show's abusive star? Before I reveal the rest, I want to hear from you. Do you think Tony truly learned his lesson after the fire scandal? Or do you believe it's only a matter of time before he sparks another disaster? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is where fans are divided, and your opinion could keep this debate alive. Stay with me, because the next chapter of Tony's story reveals secrets so disturbing, they might change the way you see him forever. The Viking baptism may have been Tony's most infamous scandal, but it wasn't the only controversy tied to his name. In fact, long before the river fire, long before the courtroom drama, Tony had already earned himself another label, one that would haunt his reputation as much as his so-called outlaw image. Many fans called him a bully. From the moment Tony joined Gold Rush, his dominant personality set him apart. He wasn't just rough around the edges. He was aggressive, confrontational, and unapologetically intimidating. And the person who felt the brunt of that force more than anyone else was a young miner named Parker Schnabel. Tony and Parker's rivalry quickly became one of the central storylines of the show. And it wasn't staged, it was real. Their conflict stemmed from one simple, brutal truth: they shared land. At the time, Parker was barely more than a teenager. He had inherited the Big Nugget mine after the death of his grandfather, a legendary figure in the mining world. Suddenly, the weight of the family legacy fell on his inexperienced shoulders. He had passion, he had ambition, but he lacked years of experience, and Tony Beets saw that. To Tony, Parker wasn't a partner. He was an easy target, a rookie who didn't belong in the same world as the Viking of the Klondike. And from the very beginning, Tony acted like he had the right to push the young miner around. When Parker first approached Tony, he came in good faith. He wanted a fair deal. He hoped Tony might be a mentor, or at the very least, an ally. Instead, what he got was a contract stacked so heavily in Tony's favor that it nearly crushed him. The terms were brutal. Parker had to pay sky-high royalties to Tony. He had to follow strict conditions that put enormous financial pressure on his already fragile operation. Every ounce of gold Parker dug up meant Tony was cashing in. And when Parker struggled to meet those demands, Tony didn't ease up. He tightened the screws. Viewers saw it unfold on screen. Episode after episode, Parker was cornered. Tony leveraged his position, enforcing rules, making demands, and enjoying the pressure he put on the younger miner. It wasn't just business, it looked personal. And Tony didn't hide his enjoyment. He smiled when Parker struggled. He openly mocked him. He played the role of the ruthless veteran, squeezing every drop he could out of the rookie. It didn't take long before fans began calling Tony the villain of Gold Rush. Some loved it. They saw him as the perfect antagonist, the man who made Parker's victories even sweeter. but others hated it. They saw a grown man abusing his power, exploiting a teenager just to prove his dominance. And here's where things get eerie. Remember those anonymous warnings Discovery received. Letters telling them Tony would bring nothing but trouble. Many of them didn't just mention reckless behavior or environmental risks. They mentioned his character. They warned producers that Tony had a reputation for bullying, for using intimidation to get what he wanted. Those letters had predicted exactly what fans later saw play out on camera. Now think about this. You're a producer in charge of the show. On one hand, you have Parker, a young underdog the audience can root for. On the other, you have Tony, the intimidating villain who makes Parker's struggles 10 times harder. That's television gold. Drama, conflict, ratings. But at what cost? Because behind the scenes, Parker wasn't just acting. He was living it. He was really struggling under Tony's contract. He was really feeling the pressure. He was really fighting to prove himself in a world dominated by older, stronger, and wealthier miners. And Tony thrived on making it harder for him. The power dynamic couldn't have been clearer. Parker was young, inexperienced, and still learning. Tony was seasoned, ruthless, and armed with decades of knowledge and resources. It wasn't a fair fight, and that was exactly how Tony liked it. And yet, this toxic relationship became one of the show's biggest selling points. Fans debated endlessly. Was Tony just doing business, or was he crossing the line into outright abuse? Was Parker truly a victim, or was this the kind of tough love needed to survive in the brutal world of gold mining? Let me ask you, what do you think? Was Tony simply playing the role of the shrewd businessman, or was he really the bully fans accused him of being? The truth is, the answer depends on how you see Tony. To some, he's the ultimate Viking, tough, relentless, unwilling to hand anything over to a kid who hadn't earned it. To others, he's proof that power corrupts, a man who exploited the vulnerable just because he could. And that dual image, hero to some, villain to others, is exactly what makes Tony Beets one of the most controversial figures in reality television. But here's the twist. The rivalry with Parker Schnabel wasn't just for show. It had real consequences. Parker's contracts with Tony shaped his entire early career. Every ounce of gold he dug was shadowed by the royalties he owed. Every victory he celebrated came with the reminder that Tony Beets was cashing in on his success. For Parker, it was a constant battle. For Tony, it was leverage. For the producers, it was ratings. And once again, the anonymous letters were right. They had warned about Tony's bullying nature, his tendency to dominate and control. And now, in front of millions of viewers, the world was watching it happen in real time. But here's the darker thought. If this is what Tony was willing to do on camera, what was happening off camera? If he was comfortable intimidating a young rival in front of millions, how did he treat his crew, his workers, or anyone else who crossed him when the cameras weren't rolling? That's the part no one really knows, but the whispers have never stopped. And in the next chapter, we'll go even deeper, into the stories that never made it to air, the rumors that hint at a side of Tony Beets far more dangerous than anything we've seen on Gold Rush. From the very beginning, the anonymous letters painted Tony Beets as a man obsessed with control. They described him as someone who demanded submission, who hated sharing, and who always wanted everything for himself. For years, those words sounded like exaggerated warnings. But as Gold Rush unfolded, season after season, those predictions began to look like cold, hard truth. By the fourth season, the mask was gone. Tony showed his true nature when he used his authority to completely shut down Parker Schnabel's operation over what he called a contract violation. To fans, it felt like overkill. Parker was young, inexperienced, still trying to learn the ropes of an industry dominated by older men. Tony could have guided him, offered mentorship, or even shown patience. Instead, he chose humiliation. Viewers didn't forget. Social media erupted with criticism. People said Tony wasn't just tough, he was cruel. They accused him of getting joy out of watching Parker squirm. And the truth is, they weren't entirely wrong. Tony wasn't finished. 4 years later, during season 8, he did it again. This time, after Parker dumped excess dirt on land leased from Tony, the Viking retaliated by shutting down his wash plant completely. On screen, the tension was electric. Off-screen, it solidified Tony's reputation as the show's bully. The warnings had come true. The same traits anonymous insiders had described, control, domination, and obsession with power, were now visible for the world to see, broadcast on national television. Fans didn't need secret letters anymore. They saw the bully with their own eyes. And yet here's the paradox. For every viewer who hated him, there was another who couldn't look away. Tony's ruthless persona fueled the show's drama. He was the perfect villain, the one who made Parker's victories feel like triumphs. Every time he tried to break the young miner, audiences leaned in closer, waiting to see if Parker would finally snap. But then something unexpected happened. The tables began to turn. Parker Schnabel, once the naive rookie under Tony's thumb, grew stronger. With each season, he learned more. He became more confident, more disciplined, more of a leader. Slowly, Parker transformed into one of the most productive miners on Gold Rush. And for the first time, Tony wasn't the only powerhouse in the Klondike. The breaking point came in season 12. After more than a decade of rivalry, Parker and his crew faced one of their toughest challenges yet. They were determined to mine every last inch of their claim, a grueling task that required not just effort but strategy. The problem: figuring out where to dump all the excess dirt. That's when Parker made his boldest move yet. He started offloading massive piles of dirt onto Tony's land. At first, it went unnoticed. Tony was busy with his own operation, buried in his endless pursuit of gold. But when he returned and caught Parker red-handed, the Viking fury erupted. For years, Parker had been the one cornered, the one humiliated, the one forced to bend to Tony's rules. Now, with his machines roaring and his crew working at full speed, Parker was the one pushing the boundaries. But this time, something was different. A new agreement between the two miners had shifted the balance of power. Tony no longer held all the cards. For the first time in their long, bitter rivalry, Parker had leverage. Tony couldn't simply crush him. He couldn't shut him down. He had to endure it. And in that moment, history flipped. The young miner who had once been bullied into submission had finally turned the tables. It was poetic justice. Years of Parker silently enduring Tony's authoritarian tactics had built to this moment. Now, Tony had no choice but to tolerate what he once dished out so easily. And strangely, from that point forward, something shifted between them. The rivalry never died. They still clashed. They still argued. They still pushed each other to the limits. But beneath it all, there was something new, a grudging respect. For the first time, Tony saw Parker not as the boy he once mocked, but as a man who had earned his place in the Klondike. And fans noticed. The narrative had evolved. Tony was no longer just the villain. He was the test that Parker had to overcome, the obstacle that shaped him into the miner he became. Without Tony, Parker might never have grown so strong. And without Parker, Tony might never have been forced to adapt, to accept, to respect. But this brings us to the biggest question of all. Who is Tony Beets, really? For over a decade, Gold Rush has portrayed him as ruthless, reckless, fearless. The Viking of the Klondike. The outlaw who sets rivers on fire, who bullies rivals, who bends rules until they break. But is that the full picture? Or is it a character, carefully exaggerated for television? Think about it. Reality TV thrives on conflict. Heroes need villains. And Tony fit the role perfectly. But behind the smirk, behind the smoke, behind the flames, Was he really the monster those anonymous letters warned about? Or was he a man who played the part, who leaned into the role producers wanted, because he knew it made him unforgettable? That's the mystery that keeps fans arguing to this day. Some will say Tony Beets was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who craved control, who loved power, who stopped at nothing to get his way. Others will argue he was simply doing what television demanded, exaggerating his personality for the sake of ratings. And maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Because no matter how you see him, villain or visionary, bully or Viking, one thing is undeniable. Tony Beets changed Gold Rush forever. He turned it from a show about ordinary miners into a story of clashing personalities, explosive rivalries, and unforgettable drama. Love him or hate him, you can't erase him from the show's history. So now I'll leave you with this. Was Tony Beets really the ruthless tyrant those warnings predicted? Or was he simply the greatest character reality television ever created? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if you made it this far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because we have even more unbelievable stories about the stars of Gold Rush that you won't want to miss. Until then, remember this. In the Klondike, gold isn't the only thing people fight for. Power is just as valuable, and no one understood that better than Tony Beets.